She had traveled 2,000 miles to be rejected 3 times in one morning. She was picking up her suitcase to leave when a stranger crossed the street, knelt in the dust in front of the whole watching town, and said 4 words that would change everything. This is the story of Ada Colton and what she chose to stay for. The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had turned soft like old skin. Adelaide Colton held it in both hands as the number 7 train groaned its way into Harlan, Wyoming, on the morning of September 12th, 1883, and she read it for what she had long since stopped counting as the final time. The words had not changed. They never changed. But she kept returning to them the way a person returns to a scar, pressing the edges, gently measuring whether the tenderness had faded. It had not faded. The letter was from the westbound matrimonial agency out of Denver, written in the careful hand of a man who signed himself only as director, as though a name might invite too much familiarity. It confirmed that Adelaide Colton, age 26 of Baltimore, Maryland, had been accepted as a matrimonial candidate and would be met at the station in Harlan by a representative of the agency who would in turn introduce her to 3 prospective gentlemen over the course of the morning. The letter used words like arrangement and suitable and practical consideration. It did not use words like hope or longing or the particular quality of silence that fills a room when the last person who ever truly knew you has been put into the ground. Ada folded the letter and placed it in the left pocket of her dress where it settled against her hip like a small, uncertain weight. She stood as the train slowed, gathering herself the way she had learned to gather herself over the past 4 years, which was quietly and without visible effort, the way a river gathers itself before a narrowing. She was not a dramatic woman. She had learned early that drama was a luxury belonging to people who had enough to fall back on when the performance was over. Ada had nothing to fall back on. She had a leather suitcase that had belonged to her father, worn smooth at the corners from years of use before the bank had taken everything else. She had a small silver brooch shaped like an oak leaf that had belonged to her mother, pinned to the collar of her gray-blue pioneer dress, the color of winter sea that had weathered over 3 years into something quieter and more honest. And she had the particular resilience of a woman who had been told no enough times that she had stopped hearing it as a verdict and started hearing it as mere weather. The train stopped. Ada picked up her suitcase and walked out into Harlan, Wyoming. The town was the kind of place that made eastern cities feel like fever dreams. One main street with wooden storefronts running along both sides, their painted signs faded by sun and wind, to the point where you had to stand close and squint to read what was being sold inside. A water trough near the livery, a church with a modest white steeple at the far end, and above everything, the sky, which was enormous in a way that no sky Ada had ever seen from a Baltimore window, had prepared her for pale blue and achingly clear, pressing down on the mountains to the west, that rose up gray and ancient and entirely indifferent to the small human drama currently unfolding on the train platform below them. People noticed her immediately. She had expected that. A new face in a small town was always noticed, and a new face with a leather suitcase, and no one waiting to meet it was noticed in a particular way, the way a chess piece is noticed when it appears on the board without explanation. Men paused in their walking. Women glanced and looked away. A pair of boys sitting on the general store steps tracked her progress with the open curiosity of the very young who have not yet learned to disguise their watching. Ada had learned to receive attention without reacting to it. She stood straight. She kept her chin level. She walked toward the agency representative, a thin man in a brown coat, who introduced himself as Mr. Fielding, and who shook her hand with the professional warmth of someone performing a transaction. The first man was waiting near the post office, standing beside a hitching post with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. He was perhaps 45, broad through the middle, with the sunburned look of a working farmer. He looked at Ada for approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds was long enough to look at a horse you were considering buying and decide against it. Then he shook his head, muttered something to Mr. Fielding about her being too slight for ranch work, and walked away without addressing Ada directly. She watched him go. She breathed through it. The second man arrived 10 minutes late and spent the entire 3 minutes of their introduction explaining why circumstances had changed since he had first submitted his name to the agency. His sister was coming to stay. He had decided perhaps he was not ready. He was deeply sorry for any inconvenience. He kept looking at a point somewhere above and to the left of Ada's head, the way people look when they are mostly talking to themselves. He apologized once more before he left, which Ada found somehow worse than no apology at all. She breathed through that one too. The third man did not come. Mr. Fielding waited with her for 25 minutes, consulting his pocket watch 3 times in a way that communicated both his discomfort and his desire to be elsewhere. He said things like, "These situations are sometimes unpredictable," and "no reflection on you personally," in the practiced tone of a man who had said these exact words many times before. Then he told her the agency would be in touch and walked away in the direction of the hotel, leaving Adelaide Colton standing alone at the corner of Main Street and Depot Road, with her suitcase at her feet and the mountains pressing down from the west and the whole town quietly watching to see what she would do next. What she did was nothing. She stood still. She let the moment pass through her the way cold passes through a window, chilling but not shattering. She had been rejected by circumstance before, by creditors when her father died, by the family on whose children she had spent 3 years teaching reading and history and the proper structure of a letter, who had let her go without a reference when she refused to accept the attentions of their eldest son, by the 2 boarding houses in Baltimore that had no room and the one that had room but not for single women without income. She knew the particular weight of being turned away. It was not a new weight. It was simply heavier today than it had been before, because today she had traveled 2,000 miles to feel it, and there was nowhere left to travel after this. She was about to pick up her suitcase and walk toward the Granger house, which she had spotted at the northern end of the street and which bore a small painted sign advertising rooms for respectable travelers, when she heard the sound of children. Not crying, running. The particular sound of small boots hitting packed earth, urgent and joyful in the way that children who have been told to wait in a shop are joyful when they are finally released. Ada turned. There were 2 of them, and they were unmistakably twins. A girl in a red knitted coat clutching a cloth doll to her chest with both arms. A boy in a blue knitted coat currently engaged in a determined effort to pull in the direction of the candy jars visible through the window of the general store. They had the same dark hair, the same round cheeks flushed with the morning cold, the same particular gravity of small people navigating a large world. They were perhaps 3 years old. They moved like 2 parts of the same creature. The man walking behind them was the reason Ada stopped walking entirely. He was tall, and the height was the first thing, the way a barn is the first thing you see when you come over a hill. Broad through the shoulder in a way that spoke not of size, but of years of physical work. The kind of build that belongs to men who have been doing difficult things with their bodies for a long time and are not looking for acknowledgement of the fact. He wore a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, despite the cool of the morning, and over it a brown leather vest that had clearly seen years of use, worn thin at the shoulders and both elbows dark where his hands had touched it countless times. His hat was wide-brimmed and the color of creek mud, pulled low enough to shade but not hide his face. The face was something Ada noted carefully and without quite knowing why. Strong jaw, not quite clean-shaved, a few days past, needing attention. Lines at the corners of the eyes that came from squinting into distance rather than from laughter, though she could not have said with certainty that there had been no laughter. And the eyes themselves, which were a gray-blue color, somewhere between skis and slate, and which were looking directly at her with an expression she had difficulty naming. Not judgment, not curiosity. Something closer to recognition, as though he had been watching for something a long time and had half expected it to look like this when it finally had arrived. Behind him, a woman near the dry goods store leaned toward another woman and said something too quiet to hear, but loud enough to know it was meant to be overheard. Widow man, rancher, trouble. 3 years alone and no woman would take the job. Ada caught enough words to understand the shape of the sentence and stored it without reaction. The man crossed the street. His boots raised small clouds of pale dust with each step. The boy stopped, pulling toward the candy jars, distracted now by whatever was happening, and the girl with the cloth doll held it tighter and watched Ada with eyes that were careful in the way of children who have learned that new things sometimes leave. The man stopped a few feet from her. He did not remove his hat. "You're Adelaide Colton," he said. It was not a question, but Ada answered it like one. "Yes, I'm Ada. Samuel Holt." He said his name the way he seemed to do most things, plainly and without decoration. "I have a ranch 2 miles west of here." Silence settled between them with the ease of something that had been there before they arrived. Around them the town found various reasons to slow its walking and its shopping in its conversation. The agency sent 3 names, Ada said. The third man did not come. I know, Samuel Holt said. I'm the third man. Ada looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them rushed. You're late, she said. I know that too. Another pause. Ada waited because something in the way he stood told her he was working towards something and that interrupting would not help either of them. I could offer you reasons, he said finally, but they'd just be reasons. He turned slightly to look at his children, and the small movement changed something in his face, some hardness, giving way to something underneath it that had been there all along waiting. The boy had stopped tugging entirely and was now watching Ada with the direct assessing gaze of a 3-year-old conducting an inspection. The girl had taken a small step closer, not quite toward Ada, but in that direction, the way a person moves toward warmth without yet committing to it. Then Samuel Holt did something that would stay with Ada for the rest of her life, not because it was grand, but because it was not. He bent down and placed one knee on the packed dirt street, right there in front of the post office with the town watching, and the mountains watching, and the gray sky watching. He knelt in the dust like a man who had left pride behind somewhere in the past 3 years and not missed it enough to go back for it. He looked up at her. They lost their mother, he said. His voice was the same low, steady thing it had been before, but it cost him something now. She could hear the cost of it. Eliza and James, Claire died when they were born, 3 years ago. Ada did not speak. She let him say what he had come to say. I won't pretend I know how to fix what's missing, he continued. I can't promise easy. The ranch has debt. Wyoming winters are harder than anything you've seen out east. And these two. He glanced at the children again with an expression that contained entire libraries of things unsaid. They don't need someone else who leaves. The girl Eliza took another small step. And then in the way of children who operate on instinct rather than strategy, she reached out and touched the fabric of Ada's gray-blue skirt with 2 fingers the way you might test water before stepping in. Ada felt it like a current moving through her. Samuel Holt looked up at her from the dirt, not like a man choosing livestock, not like a man conducting a transaction. He looked at her the way a person looks when they are asking for something they do not believe they have any right to ask for. And then so quietly that only she could hear it above the wind and the watching and the long noise of an ordinary September morning, he said, "Be the mother of my children." Something cracked open in Adelaide Colton's chest. Not painfully. More the way a window cracks open to let in a season that has been outside waiting for a long time. She stood with those 3 words sitting in the middle of her and felt the particular weight of a choice that would define everything that came after it. She did not answer immediately. She looked at Eliza, who was watching her with the patient gravity of a child who has learned to wait for things. She looked at James, who had crossed his arms over his chest and was regarding her with the defensive skepticism of a boy who had decided not to be fooled again. She looked at the man kneeling in the street who had not moved, who was waiting without rushing her, who had offered her truth instead of promise. Then Adelaide Colton picked up her suitcase. "Take me to the ranch," she said. Samuel Holt stood. Dust clung to the knee of his trousers. He nodded once, the nod of a man who does not have words for what he is feeling and has decided not to attempt them. They walked to his wagon without ceremony, and the town watched them go. It was only when they had left the main street and were moving along the rutted track that ran west toward the foothills with Eliza already asleep against Ada's arm, and James sitting rigidly between them, staring at the road ahead, that Ada permitted herself to understand what she had done. She had not done it for Samuel Holt, though she could see already that he was a man worth understanding. She had not done it for the ranch or the arrangement or any calculation of security. She had done it for the small fingers that had touched her skirt. She had done it because something in the practiced patience of those 2 children, the way they waited without hope but without giving up, had recognized something in her that was exactly the same. Ada looked straight ahead at the mountains growing larger as they approached. She breathed the cold, clean air of Wyoming, which smelled like pine and distance, and things that had never been asked to be anything other than what they were. She did not yet know what was waiting for her. She would learn, but she did not look back. They were almost to the edge of town when Ada's attention caught on something she had not been looking for. The wagon rolled past the bakery, its window yellow with lamplight, even at mid-morning, and in that window stood a woman who was not doing any of the things one does in a bakery. She was not buying bread. She was not paying. She was standing squarely at the glass with her hands folded in front of her, and she was watching the wagon with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for it. The woman was perhaps 39 years old, though she wore her age the way expensive fabric wears time, not diminished by it, but refined. Her dress was black velvet, fitted precisely with a brooch at the throat that caught the light. Her hair was dark brown and pinned in a style that required either a maid or considerable skill. Her face was the kind of face that photographers preferred, strong-featured and symmetrical, the sort of face that would appear commanding in a portrait and likely did. None of that was what fixed Ada's attention. What fixed it was the expression. The woman was not smiling. She was not frowning. She wore the careful neutrality of someone who has trained themselves not to show what they are actually calculating, and she wore it with the ease of long practice. Her gray eyes moved from the wagon to Ada and rested there measuring, and when Ada met them directly, the woman did not look away. Instead, very slowly she smiled. It was the kind of smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. It was the kind of smile that says, "I see you, I have taken your measure, and I am not concerned." The wagon rolled on. The woman in the bakery window receded behind them. Ada stored that face in the careful inventory she kept of things worth remembering. She said nothing. She would not learn the woman's name until that evening, when she stopped at the Granger house to leave a letter for posting to Baltimore, a brief and somewhat formal note to her cousin, informing him of her new address and new circumstances. Mabel Granger, who ran the boarding house and who had been the only person in Harlan to meet Ada's arrival with something resembling warmth, set a cup of tea in front of her without being asked and said the name before Ada could finish forming the question. "Vera Calloway," Mabel said. Her voice carried the particular weight of a woman who knows a great deal and has spent years choosing how much to say. "Widow. Her husband ran the first bank of Harlan, passed 2 years ago and left her the bank's influence, if not the bank itself." She paused and turned a glass in her hands. "And for the past 3 years, most of this town has been expecting that she and Samuel Holt would eventually make a practical arrangement." Ada wrapped her hands around her teacup. "Does she have any claim on him?" Mabel looked at her for a moment. "No, but she believes she does, which in a town this size is often the same thing." Ada considered this. Through the window of the Granger house, she could see the far end of Main Street, where the bakery light was now dark. "She watched us leave today." "I expect she did." She smiled. Mabel set down the glass. "That's the one to watch for," she said. "Not the frown, not the sharp words, the smile." Ada thanked her for the tea, collected her change, and walked back out into the early evening of Harlan, Wyoming. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, feeling the cold coming down off the mountains with the seriousness of a Wyoming September. And she thought about that smile. She had known women like Vera Calloway before. Not the money, not the specific circumstance, but the particular species of opposition that wore the costume of civility. She had encountered it in the drawing rooms of Baltimore, in the kitchen politics of wealthy houses, in the careful social machinery of people who understood that the most effective weapon is one the target cannot point to without appearing paranoid or ungrateful. Ada was neither paranoid nor ungrateful. She was simply paying attention. She walked back to the wagon where Samuel was waiting to drive her the rest of the way to the ranch, and she climbed up without comment. James had fallen asleep somewhere along the way back and was leaning against his father's arm. Eliza was awake, watching Ada with those careful dark eyes. "She likes you," Samuel said quietly, nodding at his daughter. "She doesn't know me yet," Ada said. "No," he agreed, "but she reached for your skirt." It was Ada would come to understand a very large thing. The Holt Ranch appeared in the late afternoon light as something that had clearly once been someone's careful intention and was now in the particular state of a thing that has been maintained by necessity rather than love for too long. The fencing was solid, the kind of solid that comes from a man who does the work himself and does it correctly, but the vegetable beds on the south side of the house had gone to weed and frost, and no one had addressed them since the previous season. The porch boards were sound, but 2 of the window shutters hung at slight angles that suggested they had been meaning to be fixed for some time. The house itself was large by the standards of the territory, 2 stories of pale timber, with a deep porch set back from a yard that had once been planned with some care and was now simply a yard. It was a house that had forgotten in the past 3 years what it was supposed to look like from the inside out. Ada stepped down from the wagon and stood before it, while Samuel lifted the sleeping James down, and Eliza stood quietly at Ada's elbow. She looked at the house and made a quick and private inventory of everything that could be fixed and everything that could not. Then she walked through the front door. The interior was clean in the way of a man who does not tolerate disorder but does not especially attend to detail. The kitchen was functional. The sitting room was plain. The staircase was narrow and well built. And on the wall of the sitting room, hung precisely at eye level, where it could not be missed by anyone entering the front door, was a framed photograph. Ada stopped. The woman in the photograph was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with fair hair that caught the light in the way that photographs from this era rarely captured. She was not looking directly at the camera. She was turned slightly as though someone had said her name just as the shutter opened, and she was smiling the smile of a woman who has been caught in a moment of genuine happiness rather than pose for one. Under the frame, attached to the wood with a small nail, was a strip of white ribbon that had yellowed slightly with time. Samuel came in behind her and stopped when he saw where she was looking. Ada did not look away from the photograph. "Claire," she said. It was not a question. Yes. The silence between them was different now, more complicated, more honest. "Don't put it away," Ada said. She said it to the photograph as much as to him. She is their mother. She belongs on that wall. She heard him breathe. She did not turn around. She stood in front of Claire Holt's image for another moment, long enough to make a kind of acknowledgement, long enough to say without words, "I know you were here first, and I know what that means, and I will not pretend otherwise." Then she picked up her suitcase and asked Eliza to show her where she would be sleeping. That first week was a study in negotiation without language. Ada learned the rhythms of the house the way water learns the shape of a vessel, not by being told, but by moving through it until she understood where she was supposed to go. Samuel rose before dawn and was at the barn before she had the kitchen fire started. The children ate breakfast with the particular enthusiasm of small people whose appetite has not yet learned to be polite about itself. James watched her from across the table with his arms crossed and his opinion clearly formulated. Eliza watched her from closer range with more patience from the doorway of whatever room Ada happened to be working in. There was so much to do that Ada was grateful for it. Gratitude for work was something she had learned early and held on to tightly because work was the thing that had kept her moving forward through everything else. She cleaned what needed cleaning. She organized what had been left in uncertain arrangements. She started seeds for a late kitchen garden in the beds beside the house, working the soil with a trowel in the afternoons, with her sleeves pushed up to the elbow, while Eliza watched and James pretended not to watch from the fence. On the fourth day, she found the letter. It was not hidden. It was simply in the bottom drawer of the kitchen work table, a drawer she had opened to look for a second rolling pin and had not expected to find correspondence in. The envelope had been open, and the single folded sheet in wide had worked its way halfway out, so that when Ada pulled the drawer open and glanced down, the first few lines were visible without any intent on her part to read them. She read them anyway. She was not sorry for it. The letter was dated 4 months prior, the handwriting a careful copperplate that suggested education and self-discipline. The salutation read, "Samuel, no honorific," which told Ada something. The tone was controlled but not cold, the tone of a person expressing feeling through the vehicle of reason, because that was the safest available method. The content, as far as Ada could read in the first lines, before she stopped herself, argued against the wisdom of a mail-order bride, cited the unfamiliarity of such women with frontier life, expressed concern for the well-being of the children, and offered in language that was entirely proper and entirely clear an alternative. Ada turned the letter over and looked at the back. On the reverse side in pencil, faint but unmistakable. Just that word. Samuel Holt's answer to Vera Calloway's careful letter of persuasion, written in one syllable on the back of the page, and returned presumably with enough quietness that it had never been mentioned again. Ada held the letter for a moment. Then she folded it back into the envelope, placed it at the bottom of the drawer, and closed the drawer. She stood in the kitchen with her hands resting on the work table, and she understood something she had only half understood before. This was not simply a matter of a woman who had expected something and been disappointed. This was a woman who believed with the confidence of someone who had rarely been told no, in a way that stuck, that the no in question was temporary, and that the temporary nature of it could be assisted. Ada straightened up. She went back to work. She was at the stove on the fifth evening, the children in their beds, and Samuel in the sitting room, reading something by lamplight, when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. Not coming down, moving. She counted them and recognized that they were not Samuel's, which were heavier and deliberate, and they were not Eliza's, which were careful and even. She waited, nothing more. She finished what she was doing, dried her hands, and carried the lamp to the foot of the stairs. The house was dark above her except for a faint line of gray under the door of the children's room. She went up quietly and stood in the hall. The door was slightly open. Inside, by the thin light that came through the curtains from the moon, she could see James sitting on the floor with his knees drawn up to his chest and his back against the foot of his bed. He was not in distress in any dramatic sense. He was simply sitting there in the dark at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the way of a child who has nowhere better to be and nothing better to do than carry whatever it is he is carrying. Ada did not call his name. She did not push the door wider. She stood in the hall for a moment, and then she went back down to the kitchen, put another piece of wood on the bank fire, and sat down on the floor with her back against the wall beside the stove. 15 minutes later, she heard the soft sound of feet on the stairs. James appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was wearing his nightshirt, and his feet were bare, and his hair was sticking up on one side from the pillow. He looked at Ada sitting on the kitchen floor in the firelight, and he crossed his arms over his chest, and he said with the flat directness of a 3-year-old who has decided to say the thing instead of around it, "You're not my mother." "No," Ada said, "I'm not." James looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. He had been waiting for what came after the no. All the women who had tried before her, if there had been any, would have softened it, would have said but, would have offered some version of the thing he did not want offered. Ada did not offer it. James stood in the doorway a little longer. Then he walked across the kitchen and sat down on the floor beside the stove, not touching her but near her, and pulled his knees up to his chest. They sat together in the warm dark of the kitchen, Ada and the boy who was not her son, while the fire burned down slowly and the Wyoming night pressed against the windows. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. At some point, James fell asleep, his weight tilting gradually until his head rested against her side with the absolute unconscious trust of a child who has gone past the point of deciding anything. Ada sat very still and did not move and let him sleep. She heard the creak of the stairs once, quietly, and then silence. When she looked up, Samuel Holt was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had not lit a lamp. He stood in the shadows in his work shirt, and he was looking at his son asleep against the side of a woman he had met 4 days ago, and the expression on his face was something that Ada had no name for. It was not gratitude, though it contained that. It was not grief, though it contained that too. It was closer to what a man's face does when he sees proof of something he had stopped believing in. He stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he went back upstairs. In the morning, Ada made a decision, not aloud, not with announcement. She made it in the way she made most decisions, quietly and entirely, like a key turning in a lock. She would stay. Not because she had no other option, though she had thought carefully about that question and arrived at the honest answer, which was that her options were narrow. Not because of Samuel Holt, though she could see already that he was a man worth staying for in ways she was not yet prepared to examine too closely. She would stay because of the weight of a sleeping child against her side, and because the floor of this kitchen was the first floor in 4 years that had not felt like the floor of somewhere she was only temporarily allowed to be. She was at the stove when Samuel came down, and she had coffee ready, which she handed to him, and they did not discuss what he had seen in the night. It was 9 days after her arrival when Vera Calloway appeared at the front gate of the Holt Ranch for the first time. Ada was in the side yard working the soil of the neglected flower beds, her knees on a folded feed sack, her hands in the earth when she heard the sound of a horse on the approach road. She stood and brushed her hands on her apron and watched the woman dismount with the ease of someone who has been riding since childhood and does not think about it anymore. Vera Calloway was in person exactly what Ada had seen in the bakery window and had been turning over in her mind since. Impeccably dressed for a visit to a working ranch, which was itself a communication, in deep blue wool with a fitted jacket that required a good dressmaker. Her hair was perfect. She carried a covered basket that Ada could smell from 15 feet away, something with cinnamon in it. She smiled when she saw Ada, not the smile from the window. This was the other kind, warm and neighborly, and so thoroughly practiced that it was nearly indistinguishable from genuine. "Thank you," Ada said. "Ada Colton, won't you come in?" They had tea at the kitchen table, which was Vera's preference, as she made clear by moving toward the kitchen without waiting to be directed. She set her basket on the counter and produced from it a pan of cinnamon rolls with the confidence of a woman delivering something she knows will be appreciated. She spoke to Samuel when he came in from the barn with a warmth that was entirely different in quality from the warmth she had shown Ada, richer and more personal, the warmth of shared history and long familiarity. She spoke to Eliza and James with the practiced affection of someone who has spent years cultivating exactly this impression. And she spoke to Ada with the particular species of courtesy that is more excluding than hostility. Every word correct, every gesture appropriate, every sentence somehow managing to place Ada at a slight distance from the life that was being discussed around her, as though she were a guest who had not quite learned the local customs. "You're from Baltimore," Vera said. It was the way she said it that carried the meaning, the slight upward inflection, the implicit question of what someone from Baltimore would know about any of this. "I am," Ada said. "How are you finding Wyoming? It must be so different from what you're used to." "Different," Ada agreed. "Yes. The winters can be quite an adjustment." Vera smiled at Samuel, and in the smile was a history Ada did not have access to. "Samuel knows. He's seen more than a few people find the winters were more than they'd bargained for." "I expect I'll manage," Ada said. Vera looked at her for a moment, and something in that look was not the warm neighbor and not the calculating woman from the window, but something else, a third thing, a quick assessment that recalibrated whatever internal model she was working from. Then she smiled again and turned her attention back to Samuel. She stayed for 40 minutes and left with perfect timing, just before the children needed their midday meal, carrying her empty basket and her careful smile, leaving behind the cinnamon rolls and the particular residue that the very skilled leave behind, which is the feeling that you should be grateful and are not sure quite why you feel something less than that. Eliza came and stood beside Ada at the kitchen window as they watched Vera's horse move back down the approach road. "She doesn't like you," Eliza said. Ada looked down at her. "No," she said. "I don't think she does." "Does that make you sad?" Ada thought about this honestly, the way she thought about most things. "No," she said finally. "I've been disliked before. It never killed me." Eliza considered this. "Papa says Mama used to say things like that," she said. Ada looked at her. "Did she?" Eliza nodded solemnly and went back to her doll. Ada stood at the window a moment longer, watching the empty road where Vera Calloway had been. She thought about the letter she had found in the kitchen drawer. She thought about the word written in pencil on the back of it. She thought about the kind of woman who had written that letter and the kind of woman who, hearing no, had decided that what she had heard was not a final answer, but an opening position. Then Ada turned from the window and went back to work. There was a great deal to do. There always was. And if Vera Calloway was going to be a problem, in which Ada was reasonably certain she was, then the best answer to that problem was not to run toward it or away from it, but to be standing somewhere so solid by the time it arrived in full force that it simply could not move her. The flower beds needed attention. The shutters needed fixing. The seeds she had planted were going to need water if they were going to have any chance at all before the frost came. Adelaide Colton, who had lately become Ada Holt, went back outside and put her hands back into the earth. She had not forgotten the smile. She had not forgotten the letter in the drawer, or the woman at the bakery window, or the particular quality of warmth that Vera directed at Samuel and withheld from her. She had filed all of it away quietly and without announcement, the way she filed most things that mattered. But what she had also not forgotten, because it was the only thing that had mattered since the moment it happened, was the weight of a child asleep against her side in a dark kitchen at 3 in the morning, and the particular quality of that weight, which was the weight of trust that has been withheld for a long time and has finally quietly, against all better judgment, decided to set itself down. For that weight, Adelaide Colton was prepared to do quite a lot, including when the time came, standing her ground against everything Vera Calloway had not yet shown her. She picked up her trowel. She went back to work. Outside, the Wyoming mountains watched everything from a height and a distance that made all of it seem very small and at the same time mattered enormously. The first month passed the way the first month of any difficult thing passes, which is slowly and with a great deal of information arriving at once. Ada learned the rhythms of the Holt Ranch, the way she learned most things by observation before action, by standing in the middle of a situation long enough to understand its shape before she attempted to change it. She learned that Samuel rose at 4:30, regardless of season or weather, and that he preferred his coffee strong and his morning silent. Not the silence of a man who is angry, but the silence of a man who needs the first hour of the day to remember who he is before the world starts asking things of him. She learned that Eliza was methodical and thorough in everything she did, from setting the table, to brushing her hair, to the careful way she arranged her cloth doll each night before sleeping. She learned that James moved through the world at a pace that suggested he was in competition with it, always slightly ahead of wherever the last moment had occurred, already testing the next boundary before the previous one had been fully established. She learned the land. She learned which boards on the porch would announce a person's weight before they reached the front door and which ones stayed quiet. She learned the particular way the wind came off the mountains in the late afternoon, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in the time it took to carry washing from the line to the house. She learned the names of the mountains themselves, not their official designations, which were recorded on maps she did not have, but their local names, the ones people used who had been looking at them long enough to give them personalities. The shoulder, the old man, the sisters. She learned the shape of the opposition. It did not announce itself. That was the nature of the thing. It arrived in the small coins of daily life, each one individually insignificant, each one collectively expensive. At the dry goods store on Main Street owned by a Mr. Whitfield, whose wife was the particular kind of social creature who took her cues from the prevailing wind, Ada found that prices for certain items were somehow different when she stood at the counter than they appeared on the board behind the counter. Not dramatically different, not enough to argue about without sounding difficult. Just different enough that Ada noted it and said nothing and paid what was asked and filed the information away. At church on the first Sunday she attended with Samuel and the children, the pew that would have accommodated all four of them comfortably had already been occupied by a family who had apparently only just decided to sit there moments before their arrival. They found seats elsewhere. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. In the bakery, in the milliner's shop, in the spaces between conversations that ceased slightly too completely, when Ada entered a room, the message was delivered without words. You are not from here. You are not certain to stay. We will hold our welcome in reserve until the question is settled. Ada understood the mechanics of this. She had encountered versions of it before in different forms in the drawing rooms of Baltimore, where she had existed as a hired person in proximity to people who were not hired. Social exclusion operated on a principle of ambiguity. The target could never be quite certain whether what was happening was intentional or coincidental, which meant the target could never respond directly without appearing to imagine slights that had not been offered. It was very clean as methods went, very effective. And in a town the size of Harlan, Wyoming, where Vera Calloway had 3 years of accumulated influence and the memory of her husband's bank behind her, it was operating at a level of refinement that Ada recognized as the work of someone with both the intelligence and the patience to sustain it over time. Ada responded the way she had always responded to obstacles of this particular kind. She became more useful. She did not become louder or more visible or more aggressive in her presence. She simply made herself difficult to dismiss by virtue of being genuinely needed. When the Garvey family 3 farms over had a sick horse and no one who knew what to do about it, Ada went over with a poultice recipe her father had taught her, a man who had been many things before the bank took everything but had once been briefly a farmer. When the Hendersons' youngest swallowed something he shouldn't have and his mother was near frantic, Ada arrived with charcoal and calm and the particular manner of someone who has dealt with worse, and the boy was fine by morning. She asked nothing for these things. She did not announce them. She simply did them, and they were noted in the way that useful things are always noted in small communities where everyone is aware that winter is coming and that survival is a collaborative activity. Mabel Granger watched all of this and said nothing until the day she said something, which was the afternoon she appeared at the Holt Ranch with a jar of preserved peaches and the air of a woman delivering more than peaches. People are watching, Mabel said. She set the grinder on the kitchen table and sat down in the chair Ada indicated without waiting to be asked twice. I know, Ada said. Most of them don't have anything against you personally. They're waiting to see how long you last. I know that too. Vera Calloway had a word with Helen Whitfield last week. Mabel folded her hands on the table. I don't know what was said, but Helen's been telling people that you were the one who insisted on sitting separate at church, that it was your preference. Ada set down the bread dough she had been working and looked at Mabel steadily. That is not what happened. No, Mabel agreed, it isn't. They looked at each other for a moment. Outside the window, James could be heard jumping from some elevated surface and landing with more force than was strictly necessary. She's patient, Ada said. It was not quite a question. She has been waiting 3 years, Mabel said. Patient doesn't cover it. Does she know I found the letter? Mabel's expression shifted by 1 degree. What letter? The one she wrote Samuel 4 months before I arrived. The one he answered in pencil on the back. The older woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said no, she doesn't know that. Ada returned to the bread dough. Good, she said. She thought about Vera Calloway with the same deliberate attention she gave to the mountains when she was trying to understand the weather. An opponent who operated through proxies and indirection was an opponent who had made a calculation that direct confrontation was riskier than the slower method, which meant that direct confrontation, when it came, was not likely to come from Vera. It would come from somewhere else through some channel that kept Vera's hands clean. Ada noted this and continued making bread. It was 3 weeks into October, the kind of day when the sky was the color of old iron and the wind had an edge in it that announced its intentions clearly, that James fell from the bridge. The bridge was a simple construction, 4 planks of pine laid across the Stone Edge Creek that ran behind the barn, wide enough for a man to cross with a wheelbarrow and not an inch wider. It stood perhaps 8 feet above the creek bed, which in late October carried perhaps a foot of cold water over rounded stones. 8 feet was enough to matter, and the stones were the kind that did not forgive. Ada was in the kitchen garden turning in the last of the spent plants for the season when she heard it. Not a shout, not a splash, a single sharp sound that was both combined in a way that took her exactly 1 second to interpret. She ran. She found James in the creek on his back in the shallows with his right arm pinned underneath him at an angle that she assessed in the first second as painful, in the second second as not catastrophic. He was not unconscious. He was not crying. He was looking up at the iron sky with an expression of concentrated effort, as though he had decided that pain was a test and he was going to pass it. Ada went into the creek without hesitating. The cold came through her boots immediately. She crouched beside him and put one hand on the side of his face and said his name quietly, and he looked at her. Can you tell me where it hurts? She asked. Arm, he said, one word. Precise. Right arm. Yes. She worked efficiently, checking without moving, unnecessarily getting her hands under him, with the steadiness of someone who has done difficult physical things without assistance, often enough that the body knows what to do ahead of the mind. She lifted him carefully and carried him out of the creek into the porch, where she sat him down and knelt in front of him and examined his arm with her fingers and her eyes. It was broken, not badly, a clean fracture below the elbow that would knit straight if it was set straight and kept still. She had seen worse. She had fixed worse. She went inside and gathered what she needed and came back and set about the work, and James sat through it without making a sound, his jaw tight and his eyes bright with the exertion of not showing what he felt. When she had finished wrapping it and had fashioned a sling from a clean strip of feed sack cloth, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not defiance, not the careful distance he had been maintaining since the day she arrived. Something more complicated than either something that had been shaken loose by falling into cold water and landing hard on stone, which has a way of loosening things in people. Does it still hurt? She asked. He considered lying. She could see him consider it and decide against it. Some, he said. It'll hurt for a few days and then less. You'll have full use of it. She paused. You're brave. I didn't feel brave, he said. I just didn't want to cry. That's usually what bravery feels like, Ada said, from the inside. James looked at the wrapped arm, then back at her. Something was working in him, some question that had been assembled over weeks from many small observations. Was my mother brave? He asked. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its customary fortification. Ada looked at this child, this young boy who carried his father's seriousness and his mother's name, and 3 years of unprocessed grief in a body still learning the reach of its own arms, and she answered him honestly. "I don't know your mother," she said. "I only know what she left behind. And what she left behind is 2 children who are braver than they know, and a man who is kinder than he shows. So I think the answer is probably yes." James looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away out toward the mountains, and he nodded once in the way his father nodded, with the entirety of his body committed to the single motion. He did not pull away from her for the rest of the afternoon. It was not much in the accounting of things. But it was the first thing. That evening, after the children were in bed and Samuel had come in from the last round of the barn, Ada told him what Mabel had said about Pierce. She had been turning it over for 2 weeks, deciding on timing, deciding on how much of what she knew to share and in what order. Samuel sat across from her at the kitchen table while she spoke, and he listened in the way he listened to most things, with his full attention and without interruption, which was one of the things about him that she had come to rely on without having marked the moment she started relying on it. She told him about the conversation with Mabel. She told him what Mabel had said about Pierce's visits. She told him what she had been able to piece together from the visible facts, which were that Pierce had called on Samuel 3 times in the previous month, which was not the behavior of a neighbor making social calls. She told him what she understood about the debt structure and the bank. She did not tell him about the letter in the kitchen drawer. Not yet. There was a time for that, and it had not arrived. "Pierce has been wanting this land for 4 years, Samuel said. He was looking at the table. He's made offers twice. Both times refused. Yes. And the debt. He was quiet for a moment. It's manageable, if the spring is good. And if the spring is not good, oh, he looked up at her, it becomes less manageable." Ada folded her hands on the table. "I think the spring being good or not good may not be entirely left to the spring," she said carefully. "I think there are people who have an interest in the question having one particular answer." Samuel looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them threw its light steadily without flicker. Outside, the November wind was beginning to say what it meant. "You know this?" he asked. "I observe it," Ada said. "I cannot prove it yet." "Yet," he repeated. "Yet," she confirmed. He was quiet again. Then he said, "What are you planning?" "I'm not planning anything yet," she said. "I'm watching." Watching is usually sufficient if you do it long enough and carefully enough. He looked at her with the gray-blue eyes that had been watching her since the day in the street, and she felt the weight of that look in the particular way she had been feeling it for weeks, which was as something she had not decided what to do with. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He gave the questions who it deserved before he answered it, which she had come to expect from him. "Someone who needed things explained," he said. "Someone learning." "I am learning," she said. "I learn everything. I've just been learning fast." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one, and Ada noted it without reacting to it, the way she noted most things worth knowing, and said nothing. The letter arrived in November. It came through Reverend Eldon, who appeared at the ranch house one gray morning with an expression that Ada recognized immediately as the expression of a man who has allowed himself to be used and is not yet entirely certain of it. He was carrying an envelope, and the envelope contained a single folded sheet of paper, and the paper contained a set of allegations about Ada's life in Baltimore that were specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be impossible to directly disprove. The letter alleged that before her departure from Baltimore, Ada Colton had been involved with a married man, a Mr. Edward Pemberton of Fells Point, and that this involvement was the actual reason for her sudden relocation west, and that the people of Harlan ought to be aware of the moral character of the woman now living in the Holt household. Ada read it twice. Then she put it down on the kitchen table and looked at it with the same careful attention she gave to everything she needed to understand. The Reverend watched her read it. He had the good sense to remain silent. "Do you believe this?" Ada asked, looking up at him. He cleared his throat. "I thought it appropriate to bring it to your attention before making any judgments." "That is a different answer than the one I asked for," she said pleasantly. "Do you believe it?" He looked uncomfortable. "The letter seems detailed." "Yes," Ada agreed. "It does seem detailed. Let me ask you something else." She picked up the letter and read from it slowly. It says this man, Edward Pemberton, lived on Fleet Street in Fells Point. Fleet Street Reverend. There is no Fleet Street in Fells Point. There is a Fleet Street in London. There is a Fell Street in Fells Point, which is likely what the author intended to write, but did not because the author has never been to Baltimore and was constructing an address from incomplete information. The Reverend blinked. Also, Ada continued setting the letter down. The date on this letter places me in Baltimore in August of this year. I have a letter from the westbound agency dated August 3rd confirming my application had been received. I also have the return receipt from the boarding house where I was staying, which was in a neighborhood called Canton, which is approximately 4 miles from Fells Point. These documents are not difficult to produce. I see, the Reverend said. Bene. One more thing. Ada looked at the letter again. This phrase, of no consequence. She touched the paper with one finger. The author uses it here to describe how the alleged relationship would be viewed by polite society if it were known. It is an unusual construction. I have heard it used in exactly this way on 2 separate occasions in the past 6 weeks. She looked up at him. Both times by the same person. The silence in the kitchen was complete enough to hear the wind against the window glass. Reverend Eldon looked at Ada and Ada looked back at him, and something in the look they exchanged contained an entire conversation that neither of them needed to speak aloud. He was not a bad man. She had understood that from the beginning. He was a man who had been in a small town for a long time and had learned to survive by not creating enemies among the powerful, which was a strategy that worked well until it required him to do something that he could not later look back on with any satisfaction. I don't know who wrote this, he said carefully. No, Ada agreed. Neither do I, not with proof. She folded the letter and handed it back to him. I would ask that you hold on to this rather than circulate it. I will provide you with the documents I mentioned within the week. He took the letter. He nodded once. He left. Ada stood in the kitchen after he had gone and stood still for a moment, the way she stood still when she was making the transition between understanding something and deciding what to do about it. Then she went to the desk in the sitting room and took out paper and a pen and began to write. She wrote 2 letters. The first went to a lawyer in Cheyenne named Theodore Avery, whose name she had obtained from Mabel in a conversation 2 weeks prior that had been about other things, but had included this name in passing, the way careful people drop information into conversations at moments when it may be needed later. She laid out for Mr. Avery in plain and organized language. Everything she knew about the debt structure of the Holt Ranch, the pattern of Pierce's calls, and the specific clause she had read in the copy of the original mortgage document she had found in the desk alongside the household accounts. The clause in question limited the rights of parties with competing commercial interests to initiate foreclosure proceedings. Pierce's interest in acquiring the land if it could be documented meant his leverage over the bank's decisions was legally compromised. She had spent 2 evenings with that document. She was not a lawyer, but she was a woman who had spent years teaching reading and comprehension to other people's children, and the skill of close reading was one that transferred. The second letter went to the westbound matrimonial agency in Denver, requesting an official written record of her enrollment date, her departure date from Baltimore, and the confirmation of receipt that had been sent to her original address. She asked for this to be sent to her at the Holt Ranch and also to be forwarded upon her request to Reverend Thomas Eldon in Harlan, Wyoming. She sealed both letters, addressed them, and set them on the corner of the desk to go with the next post. Then she went back to the kitchen and made supper. She did not tell Samuel about the letters until 2 evenings later when they were sitting by the fire after the children were asleep and he had started to say something about Pierce visiting the barn road again without coming to the house. She told him then, calmly and completely, what she had written and to whom and why. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the fire for a while. "You've been doing this since when?" he asked. "Since about the 2nd month," Ada said. "I noticed the debt document early. The rest of it assembled gradually." Samuel turned and looked at her. His face in the firelight was a complicated thing full of something she could not name precisely, but that she had been watching build for weeks the way weather builds before it breaks. "You didn't tell me," he said. "It was not an accusation. It was closer to wonder." "I didn't want to tell you something I couldn't yet support," Ada said. "I wanted to have something worth saying before I said it." He was quiet for a long time. "Vera," he said, The name came out carefully as though he were placing it somewhere specific rather than just speaking it. I think so, Ada said. I cannot prove it. Another silence. Then, the letter she sent me, 4 months before you arrived. Ada looked at him. She had not told him about the letter in the kitchen drawer. He had not told her he knew she knew. You saw me find it, she said. I came into the kitchen the morning after, and the drawer was closed, and you were making bread, and you looked at me exactly the way you look at things you have decided to put somewhere safe and come back to later. Ada considered this. You read people carefully, she said. So do you, he said. That's how I knew. They sat with this for a moment, this mutual understanding of having watched each other closely from the beginning, which was a form of intimacy that neither of them had discussed, but that had been building the whole time without requiring any particular decision. She wrote no, Samuel said, and that was my complete answer. I know, Ada said. She is not a woman who accepts incomplete answers easily. No, Ada agreed. She is not. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the fire. I should have seen what she was doing sooner. You were occupied, Ada said. It was not an excuse she was offering him. It was a fact. You were occupied with the ranch and the children and 3 years of carrying a very large weight by yourself. That tends to narrow the field of attention. He looked at her sideways, and in the look was something that had been there for weeks, patient and banked, waiting for whatever condition it needed before it could show itself fully. Ada, he said. She waited. He picked up her hand from where it lay on the arm of the chair. Not urgently, not dramatically, the way you pick up something that has been lying near you for a long time and that you have finally decided belongs somewhere specific. He held it in both of his, which were calloused and warm and large, in the way of hands that have done real work for a long time. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The fire spoke for them, and outside the Wyoming night was vast and cold and indifferent, and inside the sitting room of the Holt Ranch, something that had been assembling itself for 2 months had arrived at the place it had been moving toward all along. He proposed to her the following week, standing in the kitchen garden in the last of the autumn light without ceremony, because that was where they were and that was who he was. He said that he had asked her once to be the mother of his children. He said that was still what he was asking, and that he was also asking something more now, and that the more was for himself as much as for them. Ada said yes. The word felt different in her mouth than she had expected. Lighter, as though she had been carrying it as a question for so long that putting it down as an answer was a relief she had not anticipated. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning in December in the small white church at the end of Main Street, under a sky that had decided to be clear and cold and entirely beautiful, the kind of Wyoming sky that appears on certain winter mornings as though the universe has made a particular effort. Ada made her own dress. She sewed it in the evenings over the preceding 3 weeks at the kitchen table after supper, with a lamp close to the work and the house quiet around her. It was not the dress of a woman from a catalog. It was the dress of a woman who had made it herself stitch by stitch, and in that making had put into it something that could not be purchased. Eliza carried flowers that were too large for her hands, but that she refused to trade for a smaller bunch. James wore a suit coat that had been altered from one of Samuel's older ones, and stood through the ceremony with his chin up and his arms at his sides with the seriousness of a boy who understood that this was an important occasion and intended to behave accordingly. Samuel stood at the front of the church in his blue work shirt under his brown leather vest, which were his clothes, the ones he wore when he was doing the work of his life, and which said more about the kind of man he was than any rented finery would have. Reverend Eldon began reading the words of the ceremony, and the door at the back of the church opened. Ada heard it before she turned. She felt it in the change of air and in the shift of attention in the few people seated in the pews, the Grangers, the Hendersons, old Mr. Pasternak, who claimed to have been at every wedding in Harlan for 30 years. She felt it in the way Samuel's hand, which was holding hers, tightened almost imperceptibly. She turned. The man standing in the doorway was perhaps 32 years old, dressed in city clothes that showed the dust of travel, his hat in his hands and his dark hair damp from the cold outside. He was looking at Ada with an expression that combined relief and urgency and something harder to name. Beneath those, the particular expression of a person who has been searching for something long enough that finding it produces feelings they had not fully prepared for. Ada did not let go of Samuel's hand. She looked at the man in the doorway and recognized him the way you recognize something you have stored against the possibility of needing it. The face was there. The name came with it. She had not seen him in 5 years. He had been a boy of 17 the last time she had seen him clearly at her father's funeral, standing at the back of the church in good clothes and saying nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and he had not yet learned that presence itself can be useful when words are not. He was her cousin. His name was Charles Whitmore. He was the only living relation she had. She looked at him for 3 seconds. He looked at her. The church waited. "I'm getting married," Ada said. She said it clearly across the space between them so that there was no ambiguity about where she stood or what she intended. Charles Whitmore nodded once slowly and stepped to the side and sat down in the back pew without further interruption. Reverend Eldon resumed the ceremony. Ada turned back to Samuel and found him watching her with the gray-blue eyes that had first looked at her in the street in September with that expression of complicated recognition, and she looked back at him steadily, and she did not look at the back of the church again. The ceremony concluded. They were married. It was afterward on the steps of the church in the cold air, with the sky pressed down clear and cold above them, that Charles Whitmore appeared at Ada's shoulder and said what he had come to say. He did it with the efficiency of a man who has traveled a long way and has learned to make his points quickly. Their father, before he died, had owned a parcel of land at the edge of Baltimore. The land had been caught in the bankruptcy proceedings, but improperly, because it had been held in a different name, and the error had been discovered 2 years later by a title attorney who had found Ada's name in the inheritance record. The land had value, enough to provide for her differently than she was currently provided for. He had been trying to find her for 18 months. "Come back to Baltimore," he said. "Sign the papers. The land is yours. It would set you up comfortably. You wouldn't need to stay here." Ada looked at her cousin at the good intentions in the blind center of what he had just said. Then she looked at Samuel, who was standing 3 feet away, with Eliza attached to his left hand, and James standing at his right with the careful propriety of a boy who was attempting very hard to behave. "Charles," she said, "you've traveled a long way. I'm glad you're well. I'm glad you found me." She paused. "You said I wouldn't need to stay here. I need you to understand that I am not staying here because I need to. I am staying here because I choose to." He opened his mouth. "The papers," she continued, "can be sent to this address. I will sign them and return them." She gestured toward the ranch direction. "The Holt Ranch, Harlan, Wyoming. Any post carrier can find it." She put her hand in Samuel's and looked up at Bonham and back at her cousin. "You're welcome to stay for supper. We have enough." Charles Whitmore stood on the church steps in the cold and looked at his cousin and at her husband and at the two small faces watching him with the evaluating gaze of children who are deciding what category to put a stranger in. He stayed for supper. He left the following morning. The papers arrived 6 weeks later. Ada signed them and sent them back without telling Samuel how much the land was worth, a decision she made deliberately and without regret, because she understood that knowing would have required a conversation she did not want to have about alternatives and different choices, and she was not interested in any of those conversations. She had made her choice in a street in September and again on a church floor in December, and she did not need to keep remaking it. January arrived the way Wyoming Januaries arrive, without ceremony and without mercy. Harlan Pierce came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon when Samuel was at the far end of the south field, and Ada was in the house with both children who had been kept home that day because Eliza had a mild cough and the temperature had dropped to a level that did not forgive exposure. Ada heard the wagon on the approach road and looked out the kitchen window and saw the black vehicle with its driver and the second man beside Pierce, who carried a leather case in a way that identified his profession as clearly as a sign above his head. She went to the front door and opened it before they reached the porch. Pierce was exactly what she had expected him to be, which was to say he was a version of a type she had encountered in different forms in Baltimore, the man of property who has been successful long enough to confuse his success with his worth. He was in his early 50s, broad in the manner of a man who was once physically powerful and has become powerful in other ways since, and he smiled at her with the smile of a man who is accustomed to being received as a welcome visitor. "Mrs. Holt," he said, which at least indicated he had done some research. "I'd like a word with your husband about some outstanding business." "My husband is in the south field," Ada said. She stood in the doorway without stepping back. "He should be in by supper." I'd prefer to wait, Pierce said. That won't be possible, Ada said. We're not able to host visitors today. She looked at him steadily. I can take a message. The smile recalibrated. The matter concerns the outstanding loan with the First Bank. The terms are coming due, and I wanted to make sure Samuel was aware of the options available to him. The options available to him, Ada repeated. She kept her voice pleasant and her face neutral. That's an interesting way to describe a bank matter that involves a party with a declared interest in the property securing the loan. She watched his expression adjust. I've written to Mr. Avery in Cheyenne about the clause in the original mortgage document. I expect his response within the month. I'd recommend that any conversations about options wait until that response has been received. Pierce looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the house at the door she was standing in, at the Wyoming sky above the mountains, in the way of a man recalibrating. You seem very certain about the document, he said. I read carefully, Ada said. It's a habit. My husband will be home by 5 if you'd like to schedule a proper meeting. Good day, Mr. Pierce. She closed the door. She stood behind it for a moment with her hands still on the latch and let the silence of the house hold her. Her heart was beating faster than her face had shown. That was all right. The heart and the face did not need to be doing the same thing at the same time, and she had learned early that what mattered was what you showed, not what you felt while you were showing it. Eliza appeared at the end of the hall, clutching her doll. Who was that? A man who wanted something that isn't his, Ada said. Did you give it to him? No. Eliza considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Good, she said, and went back to the sitting room. Ada listened to Pierce's wagon move back down the approach road and waited until she could no longer hear it. Then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window, looking at the mountains that were, as always, watching everything from a great and patient distance. She had 2 letters she was waiting to hear back from. She had a husband who now knew the full shape of what they were facing. She had 2 children who, in their separate and specific ways, had begun to trust her with the particular trust that children extend when they decide after careful deliberation that a person is the kind who stays. And she had a woman in this town who had written a letter and sent it through a minister and was waiting with the patience of someone who has waited before for whatever she had started to finish itself. The kettle came to the boil. Ada poured her tea and sat down at the kitchen table and picked up the small book she had been reading her way through a novel from a box of her father's things she had brought west in the leather suitcase, and she read 3 pages of it with the complete attention of a woman who has learned that the mind requires rest in the same way the body does, and that rest is not the same thing as surrender. Outside, the January wind came off the mountains with its particular conviction. Ada turned a page. She was not afraid. She had decided not to be afraid some time ago, or rather she had decided that afraid was not the operative category. Careful was the operative category. Prepared was the operative category. She was both of those things, and she intended to remain both of those things, and she believed with a quietness that required no announcement that prepared and careful and the kind of patient that comes from having nothing left to lose would prove in the end to be sufficient for whatever Vera Calloway and Harlan Pierce still had in mind. She believed this not because she was optimistic by nature, which she was not, but because she had spent 4 months watching and listening and working, and what she had built in those 4 months quietly and without ceremony, in the dark hours of early mornings and the long evenings by the fire, and the ordinary daily work of being present and useful and real, was not nothing. It was in fact the most solid thing she had built in years, and she intended to keep it. The wind pushed at the kitchen windows. The lamp held its light. Ada read her book and waited for spring, and did not look away from anything. February in Wyoming is not a month. It is a declaration. It announces itself with the particular authority of a thing that has been building strength for 3 months and has finally decided to demonstrate what it has been saving. The temperature drops in a way that is less like cold and more like pressure, as though the air itself has acquired weight and intention. The sky lowers. The mountains disappear behind cloud that is not cloud, but the leading edge of something larger and more serious than cloud. Ada had been watching the weather for a week before it arrived. She had grown up in a city where weather was an inconvenience, something that made you wet or cold or late, something you moved through on your way to a destination. In Wyoming, she had learned that weather was not something you moved through. It was something that moved through you if you were unlucky or around you if you were prepared. She had been preparing since January. The root cellar was stocked. The wood was split and covered and stacked close to the house, reachable from the back porch without crossing open ground. The medical supplies, such as they were, had been organized on the shelf beside the kitchen stove where the warmth kept them accessible. She had 3 weeks of provisions laid in, not because she expected 3 weeks of being unable to move, but because she had read enough about Wyoming winters in the almanac she had found in the sitting room bookshelf to understand that the range of possibilities ran from inconvenient to catastrophic, and she preferred to prepare for the catastrophic end of that range and be pleasantly surprised. Samuel had watched her preparations without comment for the first week, and then had helped without being asked, which was the manner in which most useful things got done between them, now the understanding of what needed doing arriving before the conversation about it. They were a household that operated by February with the efficient quietness of people who have learned each other's rhythms. Not the ease of long familiarity which takes years, but the specific efficiency of two careful people who had been paying close attention for 5 months and had accumulated through that attention a working knowledge of each other that many couples married for decades had not achieved. Ada knew that Samuel's shoulder tightened when he was worried about something he had not yet decided how to address. She knew that he checked the barn 3 times before bed when the weather was uncertain, twice when it was not. She knew that he was underneath the plainness and the brevity, a man of considerable tenderness that he expressed in action rather than language in the wood he left split by the kitchen door before she had mentioned needing it, in the way he always came in from the cold and checked on both children before he removed his coat. Samuel knew that Ada went still when she was working through a problem, not inactive but motionless in a particular way, like a river running deep rather than wide. He knew that she had an inventory of things she watched and noted and did not speak about until she had sufficient material to say something worth saying. He knew she was not a woman of performed emotion, but that the emotion was there and was genuine and ran deep in proportion to how rarely it surfaced. Between them something had settled that neither of them had named because naming it would have made it something they needed to discuss, and they were both in their own ways people who preferred to let real things establish themselves through time and action rather than through declaration. The storm came in on a Wednesday night. By Thursday morning, the visibility from the kitchen window was the length of the porch. James had been coughing since Tuesday. Ada had noted it with the particular attention she gave to the health of small people in cold weather, cataloging the sound of it, the frequency, the quality of his breathing before and after. She had given him extra blankets and kept him near the stove and watched his face for the color that would tell her the situation had changed from manageable to serious. By Thursday evening, his face told her. The fever came up fast the way fevers do in children, with a speed that always surprised people who had not watched it before, though it did not surprise Ada. She had the cool claws ready before the temperature reached the height that concerned her. She had the ginger tea prepared in the way her mother had taught her, weak enough to stay down, warm enough to help. She sat with him through the night, monitoring, adjusting, doing the methodical work of care that is mostly waiting and mostly not showing the fear underneath the waiting. By Friday morning, Eliza had it too. The first cough came at breakfast, a single dry sound that made Ada set down her coffee cup and look across the table at the girl with the direct attention of someone who has just received information they were not hoping for. Eliza looked back at her with the serious eyes of a child who understood in some wordless way that this was significant. "How do you feel?" Ada asked her. "Like the inside of my head is too big for the outside," Eliza said. Ada put her hand to the child's forehead. Then she stood up and went to the window and looked out at the blizzard that had been making its position clear since Wednesday night. She stood there for 30 seconds. Then she made the calculation she needed to make, the one about what could be done and what could not be done and what the consequences were of the difference. The nearest doctor was in a town called Larrabee, which under normal conditions was 4 hours by horse. Under current conditions, it was an unknown. The roads were buried. The temperature was killing. The visibility was such that a man could get lost between his front porch and his barn if he was not prepared. The children were sick, both of them, and the fever in James had been climbing since Thursday. She turned from the window and found Samuel standing in the kitchen doorway in his work coat, having come in from the morning barn, round his hat and shoulders white with accumulated snow. He looked at her face and understood immediately. He crossed the kitchen and put his hand to James's forehead, then to Eliza's, and his jaw set in the specific way that meant he had made a decision. "I'll go to Larrabee," he said. Ada looked at him. Outside the window, the storm pressed against the glass with the seriousness of something that does not negotiate. She ran the calculation again, the one about the children's condition and the storm's condition and the doctor's location and the road between here and there, and she arrived at the same answer she had arrived at the first time, which was that there was no good option available, and this was the least bad one. "Take the gray," she said. "She knows the road better than any of the others." He was already moving. She followed him to the mudroom and stood in the doorway while he put on the second coat over the first and the thick gloves over the thinner ones and the wool muffler she had made in November, because she had looked at the almanac and made a judgment about what the winter would require. He stopped at the door and looked at her. The moment between them was full of everything that did not need to be said, because they had been building toward this particular kind of understanding for 5 months, the understanding that some things are communicated more completely by a look than by the longest speech, and that people who have been paying close attention to each other know the difference. "Come back," Ada said. The two words carried everything she meant, which was more than their literal content, and which she trusted him to understand. He looked at her for one more second. Then he nodded once in the way he nodded when words were insufficient, and he opened the door and the storm received him. She stood at the door and listened to the sound of the gray horse's hooves, and then the sound of the wind which swallowed the hooves, and then silence. Then she went back to her children. The hours that followed were among the longest of Ada's life, though not in the way that dramatic hours are usually long. They were long in the way that the hours of genuine uncertainty are long, the hours when you are doing exactly what needs to be done and doing it as well as it can be done. And you are still aware that what needs to be done may not be sufficient, and that awareness sits alongside everything else like a cold and patient companion who will not be dismissed. She worked. She worked with the cool cloths and the ginger tea, and the steam from the large pot she kept simmering on the stove, which she had learned from Mabel, was the old method for the kind of chest ailment that winter brought to small children. She worked by lamplight as the afternoon darkened early into the gray dark of a blizzard afternoon. She moved between the two children, one in each of the chairs she had pulled close to him. The stove, Eliza with her cloth doll pressed to her chest, and her eyes half closed, and James lying still with the particular stillness of a child whose body is using all available resources and has none left for movement. She talked to them quietly, not to elicit response, but because she had discovered early that the sound of a calm voice had a physical effect on children in distress, the way music has a physical effect entering through the body rather than the mind. She told them about Baltimore, about the harbor which was cold in winter and alive with ships. From places she named for them, London and Rotterdam, and Lisbon, places that existed for James and Eliza only as sounds, but that she made into pictures for them with the skill of someone who had spent years making things comprehensible for children. Eliza said in a voice made thin by fever, "Did you like Baltimore?" Ada wrung out a cloth and laid it across her forehead. "Parts of it," she said honestly, "not all of it." "Which parts?" "The harbor at dawn, the smell of bread from the bakeries on Pratt Street in the morning." She paused. "My mother's garden." "What did she grow?" "Lavender, and a kind of climbing rose that came back every spring, no matter what the winter had done to it." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Her eyes closed, the cloth cool on her forehead. "Like you," she said. Ada stopped what she was doing. "What do you mean?" she said quietly. "You came back," Eliza said, "in the spring, like the rose." The words arrived in Ada's chest with a force entirely disproportionate to their size, the way certain true things do the small ones that arrive without warning and contain more than they appear to hold. She sat beside Eliza and held her hand and did not speak for a while. It was past 10 o'clock at night, the storm at its fullest and most emphatic, when the knock came at the front door. Ada had been expecting Samuel, even though she understood it was far too early for Samuel to have reached Larrabee and returned. She knew the sound of his knock, the pattern of his particular way of announcing himself at his own door, which was 3 beats even, with the second slightly lighter than the first and third. What she heard was not that. She set down the cloth she was holding, checked both children, pulled her shawl tighter, picked up the lamp, and walked to the front door. She stood with her hand on the latch for one breath. Then she opened it. The woman standing in the doorway of the Holt Ranch in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard at 10 o'clock on a February night was not who Ada would have named if someone had asked her to predict. She was not who Ada would have thought of second or third or any position in a list of likely visitors on a night when no sane person would be abroad. Vera Calloway stood in the doorway with snow in her hair and her black coat soaked through at the shoulders, and a wicker basket in her hands. She had no driver behind her, no wagon visible in the white dark of the yard. She had come alone on foot or on horse through the worst weather the winter had yet produced. Her face was cold to the point of high color in her cheeks, and something else in it that Ada had not seen there before, stripped of the careful control that was its usual architecture. She looked like a woman who had walked a long way through difficult conditions and had not spent any of the walk thinking about how she would appear at the end of it. For a moment they stood looking at each other across the threshold. "I heard the children were ill," Vera said. Her voice was different. Not the drawing room voice, not the voice she used in public. This was another voice, older and plainer and more direct. "I have eucalyptus and dried elderberry and white willow bark. I am not a doctor, but I have lived in this territory for 15 years. Ada looked at her. She looked at the basket. She looked at the woman's face, which contained, stripped of its usual management, something that Ada recognized because she had felt it herself, the face of someone who is doing something because they cannot not do it, because there is a thing in front of them that overrides the considerations that would ordinarily govern their behavior. Ada stood aside. Vera Calloway stepped into the Holt Ranch for the first time in a year and did not look around her at the house, and did not look for Samuel, and did not do any of the things that would have been characteristic of her usual self. She went directly to the kitchen where the two children were, and she set down her basket and she looked at the children with the focused attention of someone assessing a situation they intend to affect. They worked without discussing it. Ada had not expected to work beside Vera Calloway in this life. She had thought about Vera in many contexts as an obstacle, as a strategist, as the source of a letter she had read in a kitchen drawer, and a phrase she had identified in a forged document as the particular problem of a woman with power and patience and a personal stake in Ada's departure. She had not thought about her in this context, which was the context of two women in a warm kitchen with two sick children between them and a blizzard pressing at all the windows. The basket contained exactly what Vera had said it contained, and she used it with the competence of someone who had learned the old methods, because in 15 years of Wyoming winters, the old methods were sometimes the only methods available. She prepared the eucalyptus steam with a precision that suggested she had done it before and knew exactly what she was doing. She sat beside Eliza and spoke to her in a low voice that Ada heard but did not try to make out. And the sound of it, whatever she said, had an effect on the child, who stopped the shallow, restless movement she had been making and lay more quietly. They did not speak to each other while they worked. There was no need for speech. The work itself was a kind of communication, parallel and purposeful, each woman attentive to what the moment required and disinclined to introduce anything that was not useful. It was past 2 in the morning when James's fever, which had been Ada's primary concern since Thursday, finally began to move in the right direction. Not resolved, not gone, but the quality of it changed the terrible plateau, giving way to something that felt to the careful hand like the beginning of a descent. Ada sat back and let out the breath she had been holding for approximately 9 hours. Vera stood up from beside Eliza, who had fallen into a proper sleep for the first time since Thursday evening, and went to the wash basin and rinsed her hands. She stood at the basin with her back to the room, and when she turned around, her face had resumed some of its usual architecture. Not all of it, but enough to suggest that she had made a decision about what to do with the next few minutes. She pulled a chair away from the kitchen table and sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at Ada. "The letter," she said, "the one given to Reverend Eldon." Ada waited. "I wrote it." She said it without embellishment, in the plain voice she had been using since she came through the door. "I want you to know that I know you know. And I want you to know that I am telling you directly rather than waiting for you to demonstrate it." Ada looked at her across the kitchen. The lamp on the table threw its light evenly between them. "The address," Ada said. "Fell Street versus Fleet Street." Something moved in Vera's face, a quick acknowledgement of having underestimated. "Yes," she said. And the phrase, "yes." They were quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm continued its work without reference to anything happening inside. "Why?" Ada said, not accusingly, genuinely. Vera looked at her hands on the table. The question was larger than the letter, and they both understood that. But Ada had asked the small version of it first, which was considerate, and Vera answered the large version of it anyway because it was the one that mattered. Because I had been waiting, she said. 3 years. I watched Samuel manage everything alone, and I thought that, she stopped. I believed that eventually the weight of it would become more than one person could carry, and he would look around and see what was available, and I was available. She paused again. That sounds worse said aloud than it seemed as a plan. It does, Ada agreed mildly. I did not consider that someone might come from somewhere else entirely. The last two words carried more than their literal meaning. Someone who had not been watching from the outside but arrived from a complete distance and simply stayed. Ada was quiet for a moment. What you were offering him was proximity, she said. I had nothing to offer him but presence. Vera looked at her. I underestimated the difference. They sat with that for a while. The fire spoke quietly. My husband died, Vera said, and before him our son. He was 4 years old. She said it with the steadiness of someone who has said it very few times and has learned to say it without the sentence destroying them. I did not tell people. It was easier not to tell people. And after some time, it became habit. Private grief is. She stopped. I became very good at operating around the edges of what I actually felt. Ada said nothing. She looked at the woman across the table, the woman who had been the shape of opposition for 5 months, and saw what was underneath it, which was the same thing that was underneath most human behavior that looked like aggression or calculation from the outside. Something that had been hurt and had learned a strategy of survival that was not the best possible strategy, but was the one available at the time. I'm sorry, Ada said. About your son. Vera looked at her. The words had arrived in the place they were meant to arrive cleanly and without ceremony, and Ada watched them land. Thank you, Vera said. She said it simply. The simplicity was the measure of how rarely anyone had said anything similar. They sat in the kitchen of the Holt Ranch for another half hour, not talking about Vera's motivations, or Ada's letters, or the forged document, or the patterns of social exclusion that had characterized the past 5 months. They did not need to. They sat with the 2 sleeping children between them, and they drank the tea Ada put on without being asked, and they existed in the same space, without enmity for the first time, which was not friendship, which was not forgiveness entirely, but was something that could not be undone, and therefore constituted a kind of change. Before she left, Vera stood at the kitchen door and looked at Ada with the directness that had replaced her usual management. Harlan Pierce in the bank, she said. Yes, Ada said. I spoke with him in November, twice. She paused. I told him that if the situation at the Holt Ranch became what he wanted it to become, I would not be opposed. Ada looked at her. I am telling you because you should know the full picture, Vera said, and because I will send him a note tomorrow that says my position has changed. She pulled her coat tighter. The lawyer in Cheyenne that you wrote to, Theodore Avery. Yes. He is thorough. If the clause in the mortgage document says what you believe it says, Pierce has no legal standing. She looked at Ada steadily. I believe it says what you believe it says because I read the same document 8 months ago and noticed the same clause and filed it in a part of my mind I was choosing not to use. A small and entirely uncharacteristic pause. You are going to be all right, Ada. It was the first time Vera had used her name. Ada opened the front door into the blizzard for her, and Vera Calloway stepped out into the white dark of the Wyoming night and walked back whatever way she had come without looking back. Ada closed the door. She stood in the hall with her hand on the door, and she breathed for a moment, just breathe the way you breathe when something that has been coiled in you for a long time has been given room to uncoil. Then she went back to the kitchen and sat between her children and kept watch until dawn. Samuel came back at first light with Dr. Emmett from Larrabee, who was a short, capable man in his 50s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been called out in difficult conditions many times and had stopped being surprised by the conditions or the difficulty. He examined both children with quiet efficiency and confirmed what Ada already knew, which was that James's fever was breaking and Eliza's had not escalated, and that what they needed now was the continued application of what had clearly already been applied: rest and warmth and watchful care. Ada stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Samuel come in behind the doctor, watched him go directly to the children. The way he always went directly to the children, touching James's forehead with the back of his hand, and then Eliza's, and reading the difference in temperature with the calibrated attention of a man who had been afraid for 18 hours and was now conducting the careful inventory of relief. His coat was still on, his boots were still wet. His face was the face of a man who had ridden through a blizzard and arrived at the other end of it and was now determining what had survived. He looked at Ada. She was standing in the kitchen doorway in the dress she had worn since Thursday morning. Her hair escaped from its pins, her eyes marked by the particular signature of a night spent in wakefulness. She was standing straight. She was looking back at him with an expression that was steady and clear, and that said without any words that whatever had been here when he left was still here. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, and his arms came around her with the force of a man who has been calculating the possibility of loss for 18 hours, and has arrived home to find the calculation was unnecessary, and does not know how to express what that means, except through the body, which knows before the mind does. She let herself be held. She put her face against the cold wool of his coat and felt the frost still in it, and breathed. "The children," he said, "are going to be fine," she said into his coat. "You." His arms tightened. "Also fine," she said. "Better than fine." He said nothing else for a while. The doctor moved quietly around the kitchen behind them, doing what doctors do, and the children slept, and the blizzard outside had diminished overnight to a steady and unremarkable snowfall, the kind that blankets rather than threatens. And the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was still lit from the night, and the whole of it was exactly what it was, which was home, which was the specific and ordinary miracle of a place that has been built by people who stayed. He pulled back eventually and looked at her face, really looked at it, and she let him. "Vera Calloway was here," she said. His expression shifted by 1 degree. "She came through the storm," Ada said, "lone, with herbs and the knowledge of how to use them." She paused. "She told me she wrote the letter, the one Reverend Eldon brought." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "What did you say to her?" "Very little," Ada said. "Mostly I work beside her." He looked at her for a moment longer, then at the fire, then at the children, and she watched him do what people with good hearts do when confronted with unexpected complexity, which is absorb it carefully and revise their understanding rather than their principles. "She has had her own losses," Ada said. "That doesn't make what she did correct, but it makes it human." "Yes," he said after a moment. "She said she would write to Pierce." Something shifted in his face. "The note from Cheyenne came last week," he said, "while you were watching the children. I didn't want to bring it in and distract you." Ada looked at him. "Very replied," he replied. Samuel went to the coat he had hung on the peg by the door and from its inside pocket produced an envelope that had been opened and refolded. He handed it to her. She took it and read it standing by the window where the light from the blanketed morning came through clear and without shadow. Theodore Avery had written 4 pages in the direct and unsentimental language of a man who was being paid for precision rather than eloquence. The substance of the 4 pages was that the clause Ada had identified in the original Holt Ranch mortgage document was not only valid, but had been, according to his research, deliberately obscured in the paperwork trail that had passed through Pierce's hands before reaching the bank for processing. This meant that Pierce had not only had no legal standing to initiate foreclosure proceedings, he had knowingly misrepresented his position in the matter. The implications of this for Pierce were considerable, and the letter laid them out without drama. The bank, divested of Pierce's pressure, had no particular interest in calling the loan early. The ranch was not in arrears. There was no crisis. There had never been a crisis, Avery wrote, that had not been manufactured by a party who stood to benefit from the crisis. Ada folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she looked at her husband, who was watching her with the gray-blue eyes that had looked at her from a street in September and had not stopped looking since. And she felt the full weight of everything that had been built and defended and survived since September, in the way you feel a weight you have been carrying only once you are permitted to set it down. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he agreed. Spring came to Wyoming the way spring always comes after a winter that has made its point thoroughly, which is with the particular force of things that have been held back for a long time. The first week of March brought a day so unreasonably bright and warm that Ada stood on the porch in her shawl and squinted at it as though it might be temporary. By the third week, the snow had retreated to the high elevations and stayed there, and the ground showed its intentions in the way of ground that has been waiting the first green along the creek, and then spreading outward the earth, reconsidering its position and deciding in favor of life. Ada planted the front garden in April. She had asked Samuel in March what Claire had grown there, and he had told her in the way he was now able to speak about Claire, with the voice of a man who was holding grief rather than being held by it, which was a different thing entirely. Lilac along the fence, small yellow daisies that came back every year without being asked, and something else, a climbing plant with pale purple flowers that she had bought from a traveling seed merchant and whose name neither of them had ever learned, but which had returned faithfully every spring since without fail. Ada ordered the seeds from a catalog and planted everything in the first warm week of April, working the beds with her sleeves rolled and her hands in the earth, while Eliza crouched beside her and handed her things with the seriousness she brought to all tasks, and James threw dirt at the fence from a distance that suggested he was not participating, but was in fact deeply interested. The response from Harlan was not immediate and was not complete and was not the open embrace of a community that had recognized it had been wrong and wished to make it right. Ada did not expect that and did not need it. What happened was smaller and more real. Reverend Eldon stopped her after the March Sunday service and said in the specific and uncomfortable way of a man making a late but genuine attempt that she had demonstrated something he wished he had recognized earlier and that he was sorry he had not. Helen Whitfield came to the ranch in April with seedlings from her own garden, handed them to Ada without extended explanation, and said they were for the front beds. The Henderson family invited them to supper in May, and it was an ordinary supper in which Ada was treated as an ordinary neighbor, which was what she had wanted and had not had for 8 months, and which felt for that reason extraordinary. Vera Calloway did not become a friend. Ada had not expected that and did not require it. What happened was that they became the kind of people who could occupy the same space without the energy that had previously been required, who could speak to each other at a church gathering with the shorthand of two people who know more about each other than they are obliged to acknowledge, and who could nod in the street with the nod of mutual respect rather than mutual surveillance. It was not warmth. It was something more honest than warmth, which is the acknowledgement of a shared reality by two people who arrived at it from opposite directions. Harlan Pierce sold his ranch in June and moved to Denver. Nobody mentioned it much. The school in Harlan opened in May, and on the first morning, Ada walked Eliza and James to the building at the end of the North Road and stood at the gate while they went in. James went in the way James did everything directly and at speed. Eliza went in carefully, turning at the door to look back at Ada with the expression she wore when she was checking that a thing was real and not about to dissolve. Ada raised her hand. Eliza turned and went inside. Ada stood at the gate for a moment in the May morning, with the mountains at her back and the sound of the schoolyard settling into the sound of a day beginning, and she felt the particular fullness of something she had no precise word for, which was the feeling of having built something that stands. That morning before the children had woken, she had been in the kitchen making the first pot of coffee of the day when she heard Eliza's feet on the stairs. Not James's, who descended at speed and landed on the last step with both feet together every morning without exception. Eliza's, which were careful and deliberate and descended one step at a time. The girl came into the kitchen still in her nightgown, her hair loose from its nighttime braid, her cloth doll tucked under one arm. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Ada, who was standing at the stove, and the look on her face was one that Ada had not seen from her before. The expression of a child who has been composing a sentence in their mind for some time and has finally decided it is ready. Ada waited because she had learned that Eliza's silences always preceded something worth hearing. "Ada," Eliza said. "Yes." "I want to call you Ma." She said it with the directness of a child who has decided that directness is the only viable approach to something important. "Is that allowed?" Ada set down the pot. She crossed the kitchen and she crouched down in front of Eliza, the way she had crouched down for James on the bridge bank in October, at the level where the important things between adults and children happen, the level where you are not looking down, but across. "Yes," she said, "that is more than allowed." Eliza looked at her very seriously. "It doesn't mean I forgot her," she said. "My mother." "I know," Ada said, "and it doesn't mean you have to." She looked at this child, this serious and careful and brave small person who had touched the hem of her gray-blue skirt on a September street, and thereby changed everything. There is room for both of us, Eliza. There has always been room. Eliza considered this with the thoroughness she gave to all important questions. Then she stepped forward and put both arms around Ada's neck and held on. Ada held her back. She felt the weight of the girl's small body and the warmth of it and the absolute completeness of a child who is not holding back. And she stayed very still and let the moment be exactly what it was. Later, when they had separated and Eliza had gone back upstairs to dress, Ada heard the creak of the sitting room door and knew that Samuel had been standing there. She did not say anything. She went back to the coffee and poured 2 cups, and when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she handed him one. James told me last night, he said. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He said he already called you that. When he was alone, he said he just hadn't said it in front of anyone. Ada looked at her own cup. He didn't want anyone to think he was soft, Samuel added. Of course he didn't, she said. They drank their coffee in the kitchen as the morning light came through the window, and the spring made its intentions clear in the way that spring does when it has finally overcome everything that has been opposing it, and they did not say very much because there was not very much that needed to be said. On a warm evening in late June, sitting on the porch in the fading light with the mountains going purple in the west, and the sound of the children somewhere in the direction of the barn doing something that involved more noise than was strictly necessary, Samuel asked her the question. Not a new question, not a proposal or a declaration. The question of someone who wants to know the truth of something, who has been patient enough to wait for the right moment to ask. Do you have any regret, he said, about the choice you made, the train, coming here? Ada thought about it. She had learned to give honest answers to honest questions, and this was the most honest question he had ever asked her. She thought about the girl on the platform in Baltimore with the leather suitcase and the letter folded in her pocket. She thought about the 3 men in the morning and the particular weight of being turned away 1, 2, 3 while the town watched. She thought about a man kneeling in the dirt of a September street and asking her for the only thing he actually needed, which was for someone to stay. She thought about a kitchen floor at 3 in the morning and a sleeping child's weight against her side. She thought about a garden replanted and a blizzard endured and a woman in a doorway in the middle of the night with eucalyptus and a truth she had come to deliver. She thought about Eliza's arms around her neck that morning, the weight of them, the completeness of them. No, she said. And then because it was true and because he deserved the full truth rather than the short version, not because everything was easy, because what I built here is mine, not given to me, not inherited, mine in the only way that matters, which is that I stayed for it. Samuel looked at the mountains in the way he looked at distances, which was with the attention of a man who finds something comprehensible in things that are very large and very far away. I know what you gave up, he said, the land in Baltimore, the other life. I signed the papers, Ada said. The money went to Charles. I asked him to put it toward the children's school fund at the church. She looked at him. I don't want to talk about what I gave up. I want to talk about what I built. He turned and looked at her. Not by myself, she said, with you, with 2 children who decided to let me. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the way he had first taken it on the night by the fire in November, without ceremony, with the complete intention of a man who has decided that something belongs where he is placing it. They sat in the evening light until the children came back from the barn loudly and with various complaints about each other that required adjudication, and the ordinary life of the Holt Ranch reasserted itself around them, which was exactly what Ada had been working toward since September. In August, a letter arrived from the Westbound Matrimonial Agency in Denver, requesting from successful candidates a letter of testimony that might offer guidance to women considering the journey. Ada sat at the kitchen table with the window open to the summer and the smell of the garden coming in the lilac and the small yellow daisies and the climbing plant with the pale purple flowers that had come back as it came back every year without being asked. She thought for a while about what to say. Then she wrote. She wrote that she had arrived in Harlan, Wyoming on the 12th of September, 1883, with a leather suitcase and a letter in her pocket and 3 rejections in the space of 1 morning. She wrote that she had nearly not stayed. She wrote about the man who knelt in the street, not because of what it looked like from the outside, but because of what it meant from the inside, which was that he had put down pride and performance and had asked her plainly for the thing he needed. She wrote that staying had been hard, and that hard had been worth it, but that she was not interested in telling anyone that hardness was easy because it was not, and the pretense that it was did a disservice to women who were deciding whether they could endure it. She wrote that the town had not welcomed her. She wrote that it had eventually found its way to a kind of acceptance and that the way had been long and that she had made herself useful rather than visible, and that this strategy, which was not a strategy, but simply what she knew how to do, had been sufficient. She wrote about two children who had let her in the way that children let people in, which is slowly and then suddenly and then completely. She wrote, rejection is not evidence about your worth. It is evidence about fit. The place where you fit is not always the place you started looking. Sometimes it is 2,000 miles away, on a train you almost did not board in a town you had never heard of, with a man who had the sense to kneel in the dirt and ask you for what he actually needed, rather than what he thought he was supposed to want. She wrote, come if you are coming, not because you have run out of other options. Come because you have decided that the life built at the edge of difficult things is worth the building. Come with your whole self and your honest self, and yourself that knows how to stay when staying is the only answer that means anything. She wrote, the rose my mother grew came back every spring, no matter what the winter had done to it. I did not understand what that meant until I was standing in Wyoming at 27 years old. She signed it Adelaide Holt, the Holt Ranch, Harlan, Wyoming. She sealed it and set it on the corner of the desk where the morning would find it. Then she stood up and went out onto the porch into the summer evening, and she stood with the Wyoming sky above her, which was enormous and clear, and the color of something she had not had a word for before she came here, and now understood was simply the color of a sky that has not been reduced by anything built too tall beneath it. The silver oak leaf brooch was on her collar where it always was. Her mother's. Hers now. Both things at once, the way most true things are. She heard Samuel's boots on the porch boards and felt him come to stand beside her without looking. She did not look back at the house. She did not look back at anything. She looked west, where the mountains were doing what mountains do in the last light of a summer day, going from gray to gold to the deep purple that precedes dark unhurried, unconcerned, as permanent as anything is. Somewhere behind the barn, James was shouting something at his sister that involved the word unfair. Eliza's response was inaudible, but its quality was clear. They were fine. They were more than fine. Ada stood on her porch in the evening of a day she would not have been able to predict from the vantage of a train platform the previous September, and she breathed the air that smelled of the garden and the coming night, and the distance that was not emptiness, but space, and she understood with the certainty that does not require proof that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because she had been placed here, not because someone had chosen her and called it fate, because she had chosen this. She had chosen it on a street in September, and again in a kitchen in October, and again on a church floor in December, and again on a night in February when the storm was at its worst, and it would have been entirely possible to believe that the thing being built was not worth the building. She had chosen it every time the choosing was available. That was the only story that mattered. Not where you come from, not who chooses you, but what you choose and whether you have the endurance to keep choosing it when the choosing is hard. She had learned this at 27 years old in Wyoming, which was later than some and earlier than others, and exactly on time. Samuel stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and together they watched the mountains go from gold to purple to the first quiet dark of a summer night, while behind them the lights came on in the house one by one as the children settled in for the evening, making their ordinary irreplaceable noise.